Hey, it's Friday, and I'm back with the next in the Fanzine Friday series. Today we're taking a look at News from Bree, number 23. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel, Old School Rules, where I celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. Each week on the Fanzine Friday series, I take a fanzine from my collection off the shelf for a closer look. This week, that's News from Bree, number 23, produced by Hartley Patterson from 1978. Hope you enjoy the video. So we're taking a look at News from Bree, number 23. This is the last issue of News of Bree that I have in my collection, so we'll move to a different fanzine next week. And again, put in the comments, please, if you have any suggestions about one you'd like to see, and if it's in my collection, I'll try to go there next. This News from Bree, as I mentioned, is by Hartley Patterson. The cover art is by Styphon Lines. I really like his art. He's got a fairly distinctive style that I always feel is sort of a sci-fi fantasy pulp fiction vibe to it. He's got this large bird here on the front and these plants, and it seems innocuous enough, but yet there seems to be a layer of sort of mystery of something going on that you can't quite figure out what it is. The editorial is extremely short. He just mentions being a few months late, and hopefully the others will come quicker, and also several of the columns that are missing, like adventures and letters, etc., will be back next time. I think I mentioned probably back in issue 20 they start using games and puzzles for subscriptions and publication, and they really just focus on putting the product together. And this time they have a number of things that are, like I said, a little bit different in terms of content. So let's take a look at the table of contents. Reviews, lots of them. We'll take a quick look at the John Norris reviews of miniatures. He covers a couple of companies. Then they cover games. They talk about Traveler, which has come out, and they give it a highly supportive review and say everyone should get it if you like sci-fi. In fact, I think fairly good job of seeing how good the game was, because they sort of say, I think this might be the Dungeons and Dragons for sci-fi. And given the success of Traveler over the years, I'd say they probably got that one absolutely correct. John Norris does a review of a game called Down Styphon, which is a war game, and Hartley does a review of the Emerald Tablet, which is also a tabletop board game. And then John Norris does a review of something called Galactic Conquest. Then we have an article from a contributor responding in some ways to Hartley's article about medieval economics, so we're going to talk about that some more. And then more reviews of a game called Elric, and then a diplomacy type game set in the in Middle-Earth called Middle-Earth VIII, and Lou Pulsifer has some suggestions on how to run that diplomacy type game in the Lord of the Rings setting. Lou has a survey we'll talk about, because I think it's interesting to see what type of questions he's asking back in 1978. And then we have a couple of Dungeons and Dragons articles to round it out. One on character ability tables, which are sort of the idea you get some sort of unique bonus for every character, or maybe negative, but a unique attribute adjustment. And then reaction rolls, which is something I think is always interesting to talk about and figure out how the reactions go with NPCs in your campaign. So I think we covered most of the contributors, or all the contributors, as we talked about the table of contents. So let's dive into the articles. John Norris is back this issue with Fantasy Fantastics, a review of miniatures put out by Heritage Models and produced overseas by Hincliffe. While he doesn't give us much model by model description, he gives a pretty broad description about these. He likes them quite a bit, starting with the Frost Giants, which he said are excellent, ogres and trolls, as well as a number of different types of orcs with different weapons that they can hold. And then when you move into the demi-human side, you've got dwarves and halflings there as well. A group of undead monsters, some centaurs, elves, ents, dragons, quite a number of really good models from this company. And then he also has a follow-up article on Asgard miniatures, which are produced by Brian Ansell, and again, not very specific one by one, but talks about them. He likes them. He says it's interesting to him that the dragons in their in their range have more bird-like wings than bat-like wings. That's an interesting thing to think about in terms of how people envisioned the wings of various creatures. Asgard's just come out with a gargoyle, harpy, salamanders, owlbears, minotaurs, unicorns, specters, and he really does say that Asgard is probably the best company to go to if you want a range that's going to be good for your Dungeons and Dragons games, in particular like if you're going to use, individual pieces on a board in front of you for some particular purpose. Then we've got the article on medieval economics, and again, this is done by Philip McGregor, and it's a response to Hartley's article in the prior issue. Again, as you guys know, this real-world stuff is not where I like to focus my attention when I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons, but he gets into this discussion about the use of metals and urbanization, and how most people lived in rural areas, and you couldn't have too much farming because of things like the type of metal and whether or not people had workable plows and sufficient land, drought, lack of chemical fertilizers. I think it's an interesting commentary. It's great that folks are really into history of the period, but I don't really find that I want to bring that kind of stuff into my game. But clearly some people did, and there's several articles that back that up. Here is I mentioned Middle-Earth VIII, which is a game that Lou Pulsifer is suggesting people should be considering. He says it was first published by John Boyer, and it's sort of a diplomacy meets the Lord of the Rings is what I would consider this game that he's talking about. And now I want to talk a little bit about the survey that Lou Pulsifer had in here, because I think some of these things are kind of interesting. Starts off with age, sex, how long you've played, how often you play, do you go to any kind of meetings on a regular basis, do you play by post, are you the referee by post, what character class do you like the most, right? Fighter, magic user, cleric, or thief. What other games do you play? What type of books do you read in terms of fantasy and science fiction? And then he wants to know, how much do you think Dungeons and Dragons is a game of skill, and compared to, say, diplomacy or chess? And then, what's the highest level character you personally have ever run? What's the highest player level and class you've ever seen, ever heard of? And the highest non-player character class you've ever encountered during a game? Then he goes on for some things he asks people to rate. For example, the following magazines: Alarms and Excursions, The Dungeoneer, Games and Puzzles, News from Bree, which Hartley's gone ahead and filled in with a 6 instead of a 5, which was the highest in Lou's ratings, The Dragon, Troll Crusher, The Wild Hunt, White Dwarf, and Underworld Oracle. I'm familiar with all of those, have some copies of all of them, and all copies of some of them. Sound a little bit like Bilbo. Then he asks you to rate the following games: D&D, Empire of the Petal Throne, Tunnels and Trolls, Chivalry and Sorcery, White Bear, Red Moon, Nomad Gods, Elric, Sorcerer, Battle of the Ring, War of the Wizards, Battle of 5 Armies, Lankmere, Wizards and Warriors, Citadel, and Dungeon. Then he has more games on the next page: Star Force, War of the Rings, Warriors of the Green Planet, Metamorphosis Alpha, Starship Troopers, War of the Sky Galleons, Ogre, Outreach, Stellar Conquest, Star Soldier, and God's Fire. Haven't heard of all of those, but I've heard of a number of them. Although I have to say I probably haven't played 80% of those games. Please read the following supplements. Remember, this is the original wood grain box or white box time period. So Chainmail, Greyhawk, Blackmoor, Eldritch Wizardry, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, Swords and Spells, and Judges Guild's first fantasy campaign. And I'm going to do a video about some of these Judges Guild products to take a closer look at what they were and how to identify the different printings and so forth. But Judges Guild First Fantasy Campaign was a product that was a collection of notes and ideas from Dave Arneson about his Blackmoor campaign, the things that weren't utilized in the D&D Blackmoor book, which remained his separate property. And then when he left TSR, he was looking to publish some things on his own. So that's what that is. Then he has some questions for referees only, he said. He says, you'll remember this was a sort of debate in the letters column about how you run your your games and your characters. And he said, for DMs, when you run your campaign, our characters only allowed to be in your campaign, i.e. they're not allowed to go and adventure in somebody else's dungeon, come back to your table with, you know, magic items or leveled up or whatever. Do you play at least every fortnight? If you have first level characters, what's the average casualty rate in your game in percentages of say, you know, party of 5-6 characters start out, how many of those are going to end up dead? What's the average size of a party? And interestingly, he doesn't say, we've talked before about a campaign sometimes would have 10-20 people in it, but the different players would play different sessions, right? He says in a party, which makes me think it's one sitting. 1 to 3 is the low end, 16 to 18 or 19 plus at the high end. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to play a game of Dungeons and Dragons with like 10 plus people at the table, but I'm sure somebody has. It seems like that would be extremely chaotic, or go on for days, or both. What's the average level of characters in the campaigns that you run? Do you use a dungeon, wilderness, or city? And I think back in those days, right, where a lot of people just went to dungeons, and so it was interesting to see that evolution now, where I think it's pretty common that we sort of blend all those things into the games that we play. What do you allow at your table? Sonics? Never. Blackmore hit location tables, the Eldritch Wizardly melee sequence system. Do you use gods, demigods, and heroes from the supplement? Do you make clerics pray for return of used up spells? Or do you use a spell point system? Remember, it's a constant theme, the Fanzine, Gary Gygax's design, where you learn spells and memorize them and then they fade from your brain. You can't use them until you rest and study. Was never popular with a lot of players, and a lot of people came up with alternate ideas. Spell points being one that I think Lou had used. And then finally, check the class or subclass of characters you allow people to use. And you remember by this point we're starting to see several in the supplement books, in Dragon Magazine, etc. So Thief, Ranger, Paladin, Monk, Assassin, Illusionist, Bard, Druid, Alchemist, Healer, Berserker, Samurai, Idiot, never seen that one, Jester, Witch, or Dragon special rules for females. So again, I hope you thought that was interesting. I found Lou's questions interesting because I thought it gave us a lot of insight into what was going on at the time. And then we have this article, which is reprinted from Alarms and Excursions. And I think it's fair to say at this point in history, Alarms and Excursions was considered probably like the premier periodical that you would read for exchanges of a wide open range of ideas from different people. It seemed to be fairly influential in the tight-knit community of people who were really into things like fanzine and rules and discussions with each other. And he says here that this article, which is reprinted and was produced by Joe Sapienza, in there, was also inspired by tables that were in Dragon Magazine #3, and then Mark Swanson in Alarms and Excursion #1 had some discussion. A guy named Joel Davis expanded that, and now we've got this sort of third iteration of this concept. I'm going to give you a high-level overview. You roll D100, and you can have from 1 to 6 modifiers. And again, these can be positive or negative. You roll 3 D10s for each talent area, and a D6 for the nature or degree of the modification. Okay, so here's the kind of thing that you would get with your rolls are from 001 to 1,000, right? Triple zeros. And experience point bonuses, improved resurrection, improved thief skills, improved detection of various things, improved stats like strength, intelligence, wisdom. The skills go from -10 to +10. The stat bonuses go from -2 to +2. And then you get a number of other things. Fire resistance, cold resistance, improved or declined. Encumbrance, rate of health recovery, number of followers, musical abilities, tracking abilities, detection of various things, use of all kinds of weapons, right? So he's got like used all axes, used all blade weapons, all daggers or whatever. So those are like a bonus proficiency, I think. Improved defenses against different types of attacks, improved saves versus different types of attack, improved use of certain types of magic, and on and on and on. And then he's got this list here where he talks very specifically to explain, like, you know, what each of these different attribute bonuses or subtractions might mean for you. And then he also has a reaction table, and it's a die 20 roll to see whether or not people will react favorably or not towards your characters. And then we have some artwork. This art is by Paul Blackwell, and you remember he drew a number of dwarves in the last issue. And then we have some art by David Erlin, and he did a number of drawings in this issue. This last one here, this fantastical world, I think you can probably tell it's just got that theme, right, for Stephen Lyons. Some sci-fi mixed into the sort of pulp fantasy. And then Erlin also does the rear cover, which is this wizard on the back. That's it for News from Bree number 23. The last of my News from Bree fanzines, at least for now, until I can find some more. Hopefully I can complete that collection at some point. That's it for today. I hope you're enjoying the videos. So feel free to subscribe. We try to put our content out a couple times a week, and we certainly appreciate new subscribers. Leave comments down below. Let us know what you like, what you'd like to see in future videos. And until next time, my friends, keep rolling 20s.